Hello, everyone. A very warm welcome to Creative Bureaucracy Festival Meets Science. I'm Julia Stamm and I direct the Creative Bureaucracy Festival. In our interview series, Creative Bureaucracy Festival Meets Science, we focus on the relationship and interaction between science and policymaking. And to do so, we have invited a broad range of very interesting and distinguished interview partners who look at the topic from many different angles. And I'm delighted and honored to welcome Sir Geoff Mulgan to today's conversation. Geoff looks back at the most interesting career, having had numerous different roles, many of which we will evoke during our conversation today. And I look forward to talking to him about how he has been inspired and has collaborated with scientists and also has used scientific knowledge and insights in his work. But before we do this, let me briefly introduce our guest. Geoff is Professor of Collective Intelligence, Public Policy and Social Innovation at University College London. Prior to that, he was the Chief Executive of Nesta, the UK's innovation foundation between 2011 and the end of 2019. Between 1997 and 2004, Geoff had roles in the UK government, including the Director of the Government Strategy Unit and the Performance Innovation Unit, and Head of Policy in the Prime Minister's Office. I will skip all your other very interesting roles. I will just highlight that you all are also one of our previous Creative Bureaucracy Award winners, which of course is very important and relevant in our context today. So many thanks for being here, and I look forward to our exchange.
Thank you.
We get started with a general opening question I'm asking all my interviewees. When you hear the words creative bureaucracy, what comes to your mind spontaneously?
Well, perhaps because I've been a bureaucrat much of my life, it seems to me obvious that bureaucracies can be creative. And in fact, I teach a course of public administration, an MPA course to students from all over the world. And I start off by pointing out that bureaucracy was behind the invention of arithmetic, of writing, statistics, irrigation, all sorts of things, as well as concentration camps and forced sterilization. So bureaucracy has always been creative for both good and ill. And in that course too, I think relevant to this discussion, we increasingly try to fuse together science, technology and engineering with public policy, with thinking about government, because more and more of the tasks of government do require leaders and officials who are as competent understanding epidemiology or the science of climate change as they are in understanding law and economics.
Thank you very much for this first, diving into what this actually means, and also, starting to talk about this relationship between science and the policymaking realm. So you are currently not in a government position. You have been in a government position before, but right now you are working at the university. And I was very intrigued by the title of your current professorship, which is Collective Intelligence, Public Policy and Social Innovation. So here a lot of different things come together, and I was wondering whether you could explain the linkages between the three.
Yeah, and I should probably say I work at the moment with quite a lot of governments around the world, with the European Commission. I'm running a big program for them, and the UN. So I move between academia and the practicalities of how governments work. For my title, I chose a series of things which interested me. The emergence of a whole field of collective intelligence. How do you organize brain power at large scale? Obviously, public policy. And the whole field of social innovation, which is how civil society, citizens themselves can create solutions and put them into practice. All of these are in a way about how we collectively shape our future, making the most of the available technologies, the capacities of the state, the capacities of society. And I think these will increasingly become central to how we think. I'm just this autumn finishing a project looking at how governments around the world organize their intelligence through the pandemic, how they mobilize data or evidence or tacit knowledge about not just the affections of COVID-19, but also things like education or mental health or behavior of the public, willingness to abide by lockdowns. And all of those are in a sense about intelligence organization. And we find very uneven capacities around the world to do this well. And if I had to make a prediction, it's that in 10 or 20 years' time, the best governments will have intelligence organization right at the core of how they work. in some ways, rather as we have finance now, and we did in the last century, where ministries of finance, the finance function was, as it were, the fuel of government, budget exercises were the key decision-making moments. I think data, knowledge, intelligence will increasingly displace money as the central organizing principle for the state.
So maybe we can, talk a little more about this particular focus of yours on collective intelligence, and also how you see this is going to be even, more relevant for policymaking in the near future, but also in the further future. So when you work with governments right now, how do you approach this issue with them? So how do you explain what collective intelligence is and how this is really relevant and important for them?
Well, basically, the question for any government is, what do you need to know in order to make a good decision? If you're in the middle of a pandemic, you do need to know if your hospitals are about to be overrun with people struggling with COVID. You may also need to know what will the effects be on school kids if they're locked out of education for 3 months or 6 months or a year. You need to know what's happening to levels of anxiety or depression in your population. If your businesses are struggling with lockdowns, you need to know when they're going to run out of cash and what the alternatives are. So in all of these ways, government has to be about mobilizing all these different kinds of knowledge, some of which can be gleaned from data, from surveys, or from mobile phone records, some of which is formal evidence, the world's knowledge of what does or doesn't work. Some of it is tacit knowledge in the minds of nurses or police officers or teachers. And some of it will be the ability to look ahead, to use models to predict patterns. And fluency in using all these different kinds of knowledge is all important, I think, to the job of being a bureaucrat or of a politician. And at the moment, we do these very unevenly. And I think this is crucial, really, for the future of the role of science in government. In our analysis, we found that many governments had amazingly high quality science advice pouring into the government, certainly countries like Germany or the UK or the US. And it was sort of assumed then that in the middle of the government, there were officials or politicians who would synthesize all this complex science and turn it into really good decisions. But what it turns out is that even if you have really good inputs of scientific analysis of, wearing face masks or of different treatments for COVID and so on, in a way, they're going into a black hole, and the core of governments often was not much capacity, let alone much method for knowing how to do this job of synthesis, how to make sense of all the complexity. And I think we will increasingly need to move away from the idea of science just as an input, just as an advice, to actually sharing in responsibility for making decisions and then learning about what does or doesn't work. And of course, through the pandemic, lots of decisions worked for a time and then stopped working, and vice versa. And governments had to learn how to be very, very agile all the time.
Let's talk about this a little longer. You have been involved in pandemic responses in the very recent past, and you've just talked about, what are some of the crucial issues when it comes to, bridging science into policymaking. So maybe you can talk a little more about what, according to you, are challenges, that really impede successful science policy interaction and, really impede also this transfer of science results into policy, both, I would say, on the side of academia, but also in terms of policymaking and government.
There are many dimensions to this question, and I've been sort of living this the last 2 years, partly running a thing called the International Public Policy Observatory, which has been synthesizing evidence on responses to the pandemic, and not just the pure health issues, but also ones like what's happening to inequality, or how disabled people, or what's happening to the elderly in care homes during the pandemic when they were maybe not allowed to have visitors for a year. And what we find, first of all, is an extraordinary imbalance of how science influenced decision-making through the pandemic. There was often very strong influence, understandably, from the medical sciences, from epidemiology, telling governments about infections and possible, exponential rises in infection rates and so on. And that drove the decisions to take incredibly drastic actions to contain the crisis. But on an issue like mental health, there was much less influence, much less status. There were almost no models predicting what the effects of long lockdowns would be on people's mental health. So the imbalances in science advice had their own effects and probably meant policy attended much more to the needs of the relatively elderly, who were vulnerable to the physical costs of the crisis, and much less to young people who were perhaps scarred in very different ways. Of course, we found all over the world a huge question of the absorptive capacity of government, the knowledge it had. And many of our politicians and officials have a training in law or economics or public administration. Many fewer have much understanding of fields of science or of systems or of data or of complex dynamics of the kind we had. So often there was a failure to know how to use the knowledge, the advice, the science coming in. So that was a problem too. Of course, there was then a problem of trust, and all over the world we found quite close correlations between how much people trusted their governments and how much they trusted science. And in some very big countries like the US, we saw extraordinary levels of distrust of both, and politicians turning against the science, and the huge anti-vaxxer movements all over the world, in a sense, were a direct challenge to the authority, the legitimacy of science. I think the biggest problem we've got, and it's one we will have, I think, more and more in the future, is that scientists were de facto pulled into decision making. They were appearing on the press conferences in the UK, almost every day the Prime Minister appeared alongside a chief scientist and a chief medical officer, getting them in a way to share in responsibility for decisions. And to some extent that was fine. They knew much more about what had to be done than Boris Johnson did, who has zero background in science. In fact, I used to chair his science committee when he was mayor of London. But of course that raises the question of what's their accountability. They were called advisors, but they were actually making decisions. And many of those scientists didn't really know how to handle that accountability to the public, and they weren't really accountable to the public. And their methods of scientific analysis were quite good in the early stages of the crisis, but they didn't have the methods to tell you when you should shift, when you might ease lockdowns, when you might prioritize the needs of the economy or of young people over minimizing infections. And as a result, we're getting a bit of a backlash against perhaps the excessive power of scientists in decision-making. I think it's a bit unfair on them in some respects, but it's quite legitimate to believe that there was a problem in how decisions were made and accountability for those decisions. So one of the things I'm working on is what should be the methods of rigorous synthesis, which go beyond what any of the sciences have, to tell you how to change gear. And in essence, I think the heart of this is that science is really about the world of facts, things we know, whether it's in astronomy or genetics or the quality of the air in the cities we live in. And politics is really about what matters and acting in response to what matters. Science by its nature is a bit detached, it's cool, it always takes the perspective of the universe, whereas politics is about the here and now, about our lives in a particular places and particular times. And these pull in different directions, and they both need each other in order to guide decisions, because more and more politics depends on science. But science on its own can't do politics very well because it's got no methods for telling you what really matters, what your values should be. And that's why I think we will increasingly need use of hybrids of people, hybrids of processes, hybrids of institutions, which can think simultaneously in a scientific way and in a political way.
I think it's fascinating, many of the aspects that you've been talking about. I would love to bounce back on them. For instance, one is the imbalance in science advice, and why did we have so little social science advice, for instance, in the different boards. Another one is really the issue of accountability of scientists and of trust. And then what you just mentioned, the importance, increasing importance of having hybrids and all sorts of hybrids. I'm wondering, Geoff, what you think about introducing some sort of training elements for both scientists and bureaucrats, to sort of understanding how the other side works, or is this something that is just too simple?
No, I think that is absolutely essential. And one of the things I do in my day job is we in my university next year launch a new undergraduate degree which tries to fuse science, engineering, policy, and social change to create and prepare the people who maybe in 10, 20, 30 years time may be running our countries. At the moment, I think universities aren't offering that grounding. I think we need to train politicians. There are some academies of politicians around the world. Australia just launched one last year called the McKinnon Institute. China trains its mayors and governors and ministers pretty intensively, including a lot of training on issues of science and technology. Strangely, in Europe, there's almost no training at all for politicians. They're expected to kind of make it up as they go along. And many of the public administration and civil service colleges are very backward looking, very old fashioned in their curriculum. So I think that's a necessary but not sufficient condition for all the things we have ahead. But if you're not trained, then it's not surprising you really struggle when you're given conflicting advice and perhaps models telling you, if you do this, your hospitals will be overrun. If you do that, your economy will crash. You know, we have leaders who don't have the mental skills, the sort of the training, the formation to allow them to function in an era where so many of their biggest decisions have a very high element of science and technology embedded in them.
Thanks very much for pointing that out. The issue of training, also the issue of, of sort of leadership when it comes to really doing policy different is something that is really very essential. I would like to bounce back on something that you mentioned during our initial conversation, Geoff, namely a report on global science that you're currently involved in, and that relates to the SDGs. And I'm wondering, sort of, what does this consist in? It is this also something that might be used for policymakers to really inform their work on, implementing the SDGs?
Yeah, so this is a project called Strings, which is about steering research and innovation for the global goals, the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN. We're in a sense the biggest ever exercise of the world discussing what really mattered, what it needed to do, what the world needed to fix by 2030. And this project was commissioned partly by the UN to look at where global science and innovation were going, R&D, and was it aligned with those goals or not? And this was a big data exercise. There will be studies of almost every country on the planet looking at their R&D spending and activities, their SDG priorities, and are they aligned or not? And the bottom line is they're massively misaligned. They're misaligned because a huge proportion of spending goes on the military. About half of all US public R&D goes on the military. Within fields like health, far more traditionally has gone on the relatively less important repeat diseases of the rich world rather than on the much more deadly diseases of the poor world. And within fields like energy and agriculture, huge imbalances, not only as to where the research is done, nearly all of it, perhaps not surprisingly, done in the rich countries, not much in the poor countries, but also the kinds of topics which are attended to. So just to take health again as an example, vast proportions of the research go on things like new drugs, far less on what we know to be a bigger explanation of health outcomes, which is social, environmental, behavioral issues, which probably get barely 1 or 2% of R&D. Now, the interesting sort of policy issue which flows from all of this, on the one hand, within each country, it's ensuring that you are directing your brain power, your science and technology, not just to military needs and not just to business needs, but also to what your society needs most of all. But also at a global level, it's very striking. We have no institutions to even discuss these matters. We have a UN, yes, we have a International Monetary Fund, a World Bank, but there are no global UN bodies which regularly take stock of where the world is putting its best brains, its scientific energies. We don't have any systematic monitoring of where money goes. And this leads to incredible distortions in emerging technologies like AI. I mean, AI has been with us for more than half a century. And it's quite clear the vast majority of AI and research has gone either to things like click-through advertising on search engines or for YouTube, or on military or surveillance needs, and far, far less on attending to some of the needs of society. And we're going to see this increasingly around net zero and climate change, which is probably the biggest challenge, the biggest priority for global R&D. How do we ensure within every country we really are directing our research capacities to this, and not just attending to the hardware questions, better batteries, better transport, new ways of building homes, but also the social and behavioral aspects of climate change too. So I hope in a way this piece of work, I say it's called Strings, begins a much more systematic debate about how we mobilize science and technology for the common good.
Yeah, building on this right away. So how can we attend to, more to the needs of society? How can we bring in the softer dimensions, the social dimensions, behavioral dimensions, etc.? I would like to talk about the book that you have published, Another World is Possible, How to Reignite Radical Political Imagination. And to me, this is really about building our futures, and really attending to those needs, to those social needs that we need to think about when it comes to really securing the future of our generations and the next. So I have read, the reviews of this book, and one of them said, they're all wonderful, but one of them really inspired me, and it really reads, Sir Geoff Mulgan reminds us that we can imagine and create change, not just fix what is broken. His book offers hope and the power of possibility. And these are words that I think are really interesting to think about also in the context of bureaucracy. So how can imagination, hope, and possibility help our politicians and also our bureaucrats to shape another world, to shape a better world?
So not surprising, I think it's vital they do. And I think it's impossible to govern well if you have no sense of where you're going, what your direction is, where you aspire to be in 20, 30, 40 years' time, even if you can never know with any precision. The prompt for writing the book was an observation from talking to lots of people ranging from teenage activists to bureaucrats to business leaders. And my experience was that they could very clearly picture a future ecological disasters of climate change. They could picture technological futures with drones and AI and so on, but they really struggle to describe what might we do with our health system, our welfare state, our democracy in the year 2050, 2060, 2070. And when I then analyzed this, I found this was actually quite an unusual situation. It makes us different from our equivalents 50 years ago, 100 years ago, who often did have quite a strong sense of where they might aspire to get to. And I think we've lost this capacity for imagination in our governments, in our politics, in our universities, which I blame a fair bit for some of the problems here. And yet I think we need it. We desperately need it, especially at a time of such complex interlocking crises. We need options. And I'm struck, I work, as I said, with many national governments, cities and others, and I think they are short of good options of what to do. What do they do about energy prices spiking, about people running out of cash, about issues like population mental health? And so we need, I think, to invest heavily in this kind of quite disciplined, rigorous imagination, picturing what would an economy look like that really was circular, zero waste. What could our schools look like a generation from now to make the most of technology, but also ensure children were socializing and learning from doing real things. And my hope is this book will prompt much more serious work on this job of what I call sometimes exploratory social science, of social design, and includes designing the institutions we need in the future. And one of the weird things of the last 20, 30 years is we've completely lost the capacity to design strong public institutions to serve us. In my country, we used to be quite good at this. We invented a National Health Service, a BBC. The US was quite good at this at one time with things like NASA or DARPA. And that's largely stopped in most countries. And yet we've got a whole host of massive tasks for which we need new public institutions. And one of the things I'm working on at the moment is developing really design frameworks for the institutions we need around net zero, or topics like cybersecurity, or managing the energy transitions of the rest of the world. And I hope this will be of interest to creative bureaucracy too, because I found a real dearth of good ideas, good materials in the universities and elsewhere, and governments which have lost the confidence that this is a task they can do. But the one thing probably I've learned from life as a bureaucrat is that you need to institutionalize things. If you really want to achieve change, embed them in an organization, an institution, rather than just a one-off project which can come and go. Most of the great successes of government over the centuries have come from embedding vital tasks, from public health and education to the improvement of public spaces in institutions. And that's what we need to do in this century too.
So I'm all ears, and I'll definitely take you up on what you've been saying, and I'll think about ways how we can also bring this in more into the work that we're doing at the Creative Bureaucracy Festival. You spoke about this issue of how to institutionalize change. I really endorse everything you've been saying. I also see the urgency, but when you're now discussing with governments and public authorities, how would you suggest one goes about it? How does one institutionalize change?
Well, there are lots and lots of different methods, and it depends on your context. But to just take one example, which I've been working on a bit this week, every city in the world is committed to cutting carbon emissions in its transport, in its homes, in its industries. Almost none of them have institutions well designed for doing this. And what they will need in the next 10 years, if we're going to achieve the necessary reductions, will be some institutions to manage money, to invest in necessary, could be retrofitting of homes or new models of energy. They'll need new institutions for data. There's a huge data task of tracking and analyzing levels of emissions and making that a public good to use it for planning. Nowhere has done this well yet at all, let alone then training artificial intelligence to do machine learning on the back of that data. It's mainly locked up in private electricity companies. There's a massive job of organizing knowledge and know-how, what do plumbers need to know, and electricians and builders, as well as citizens themselves. Now, this is just one example where we need a creative, imaginative period of institutional design to help us through this incredibly difficult task of transition and transformation. The business world will invent some new institutions of its own for this, and they already have, on everything from investment to ESG to Elon Musk building batteries. But the public sector has to be as agile and as imaginative, because it's got probably an even bigger role to play in the transition.
Yeah, so let's conclude with this question that really ties to what you've just said. The public sector needs to be more creative. The public sector needs to be more creative, more imaginative. So, because we're talking about creative bureaucracy here, this is really the idea that we also want to push. So, how can creative bureaucracy? How can bureaucrats, who embrace imagination, also strengthen, the relationship and the transfer between science and policy to really help create this better world that we've been speaking about?
In a way, I think bureaucrats, like everyone else, need a kind of double mind. In other words, it's a contradictory mind. And this is what you find in any field of science too. On the one hand, I'm really keen on using evidence. If you are running tax collection, if you're running, the energy department, whatever it may be, you need to be drawing on the best available knowledge from across the world. You need to be synthesizing that knowledge, acting in the light of it. And this is what every scientific discipline does. And I still think we're a very long way in the public sector from using evidence well and really drawing on the best of global experience. But you also need to be imagining and creating and innovating, usually on a small scale, and smaller scale than the implementation, and often fast, through pilots, through test beds, through innovation teams and innovation labs. And I've spent much of my career working on the practicalities of how you do that. How do you organize money in a public bureaucracy to do experiments? How do you analyze them? How do you involve citizens in shaping them? How do you push the boundaries of your creativity? And some of my recent book has lots of the methods you can use to help generate more radical, more exciting options to test out. And we need both of those. And those are also the two sides of science. One is the normal science of synthesis and cumulative knowledge. And the other is the science of dramatic breakthroughs and thinking in wholly fresh ways. And so that's one, this is probably what my ideal bureaucracy in some ways is a bit like science in that respect. And has this double mind, on the one hand, speculative, exploratory dynamic, and on the other hand, systematic and rigorous and focused and drawing on the best of our shared inheritance of knowledge. And that shouldn't be too hard, but it's a rather long way from current practice, I suspect.
Thank you so much, Geoff. There's nothing that I want to add after your wonderful concluding words. So thank you very much. We'll definitely take what you said on board. And I really also hope that we'll find a platform for this at our next Creative Bureaucracy Festival to continue this line of thinking and acting. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.